I received a game key for Evil Inside VR from JanduSoft for review purposes. Developed and published by JanduSoft, Evil Inside VR released on May 7th of 2026 for PSVR 2 and MetaQuest, as a virtual reality adaptation of the original 2021 release. The original version of Evil Inside never really stood out as anything special, mostly because it leaned so heavily on the formula established by PT without doing much to separate itself. Still, bringing a horror game like this into VR makes sense. Slow hallway exploration, sudden scares, strange noises, and looping environments naturally become more effective when you are physically standing inside them. Even if the original game was rough around the edges, the VR format alone gives the experience a stronger sense of tension and immediacy that makes this version more interesting than it probably would have been otherwise.
Mom?
The story centers around Mark, a teenager trying to process the death of his mother after she was found in a well and his father was arrested for her murder. Desperate for answers, Mark attempts to contact her through a Ouija board, but things immediately spiral out of control when the board violently breaks apart and he loses consciousness. From there, he finds himself trapped in a distorted version of his home that endlessly loops in on itself. As you move through the house collecting scattered pieces of the broken board, reality starts to bend further and further. Strange figures appear in corners, doors open on their own, lights flicker, and the line between paranormal activity and Mark's mental state becomes increasingly blurred. The setup itself is decent enough, and there is at least a small sense of mystery pushing things forward, but the story never really evolves beyond its main premise. Since the game can easily be finished in under an hour, there's not much room for character development or deeper exploration of the themes it hints at. There is a final twist near the end, but it lands with more of a shrug than a genuine payoff because the game does not spend enough time building toward it. It is one of those horror stories that works well enough while you're inside the moment, but once the credits roll, there's not much left to really think about afterward. JanduSoft describes this VR release as a complete reimagining with redesigned gameplay, puzzles, lighting, and scares. But in reality, this is almost exactly the same as before, just translated into virtual reality. That is probably the biggest disappointment surrounding the game. If you already played the original, there's barely anything new waiting for you here. There are no meaningful additions to the story, no expanded areas to explore, or no extra sequences that take advantage of VR in especially creative ways. Outside of being able to physically pick up certain objects around the house, the experience remains largely unchanged. Gameplay revolves around repeatedly walking through the same looping hallway while waiting for new paranormal events to trigger. Mark moves painfully slow throughout the entire game, since it seems as if he has a limp. And because there is no sprint option, the pacing can become frustrating after a while. Much like PT, progression is tied to environmental changes and interacting with specific objects. Sometimes a locked basement door suddenly opens, sometimes you need to enter a number sequence into a box, or peer through a hole in the wall to activate the next sequence. Along the way, you will deal with creepy encounters involving distorted figures, loud jump scares, stalking enemies, and bizarre imagery like floating baby heads.
Do you remember this well?
Some of the scares genuinely work well in VR because the added immersion naturally makes sudden noises and close encounters more intense. Walking through dark hallways with headphones on while things shift around you can absolutely create tension if you allow yourself to get absorbed into the atmosphere. Problem is that the game rarely builds on those moments in interesting ways. Most scares rely on loud audio stings or quick visual interruptions rather than carefully constructed psychological horror. Once you recognize the formula, it becomes predictable pretty quickly. The puzzles do not help much either. Nearly every interaction feels extremely basic, and there is little satisfaction in solving anything because most solutions are straightforward. A lot of the game simply involves slowly walking from one end of the hallway to the other until the next scripted event activates. Sometimes you can interact with objects like breaker switches, flashlights, or a record player, but these moments feel more like small distractions than meaningful gameplay mechanics. VR gives the game more presence, but it does not fundamentally improve the design underneath it. Visually, the game looks serviceable but unremarkable. The house itself has a decent atmosphere at times, especially when the lighting shifts into deeper reds or when shadow distort across the hallway. Some environmental moments manage to create a solid sense of dread simply because of how confined the VR perspective feels. Still, the presentation overall feels dated. Character models look stiff, certain objects have low resolution textures, and some environments appear strangely angular up close. One of the more disappointing choices is that the opening and ending cutscenes play on a flat virtual screen instead of fully immersing you in the scenes themselves, which weakens the atmosphere during the only story moments.
And we have breaking news that arrives from the north of the state of Oregon. Here we have Mary Jane Anderson, our reporter at the crime scene.
Thanks, Joe. They found the body of Rose, the woman who went missing last Monday.
The audio design lands somewhere in the middle as well. The screeching sound effects and sharp musical cues during jump scares are effective enough to get a reaction, especially in VR where spatial audio adds extra punch. Ambient sounds like creaking floors and distant noises help maintain tension while exploring the house. But the game never reaches the unsettling sound design heights of the game it clearly takes inspiration from. Whenever Evil Inside VR attempts to recreate the eerie feeling of PT, it usually stops at surface level imitation without adding its own personality or creativity to those moments. What makes the game frustrating is that there are glimpses of potential throughout it. Being trapped inside a looping haunted house in VR is already a strong setup. The atmosphere can work. Some scares absolutely land. There are moments where simply turning around a corner feels uncomfortable in the best way possible. But the game never expands beyond the basics. Everything feels safe, familiar, and heavily borrowed from better horror games that already explored these ideas years ago. Overall, Evil Inside VR is fine for what it is, but it is difficult to recommend outside of very specific circumstances. If you have never played the original and you are specifically looking for a short VR horror experience inspired by PT, there is some entertainment value here. The VR immersion alone does elevate the scares enough to make the experience more engaging than the flat screen version. At the same time, the lack of originality, repetitive structure, simplistic gameplay, and extremely short runtime make the price harder to justify. If you already played the original game, there is very little reason to revisit it unless you are simply curious about experiencing the scares in virtual reality. I give Evil Inside VR a 3.5 out of 10.